David had been dreaming about this moment for 2 years. Standing in the driveway of his new lakefront property, he took a deep breath and smiled. The morning sun was just starting to peek over the mountains, casting golden light across the water, his lake. After months of paperwork, negotiations, and sleepless nights wondering if the deal would fall through, he'd finally done it. The property was everything he'd hoped for and more. 15 acres of pure paradise with an old cottage that had character written all over it. Sure, it needed work, but that was part of the charm. The previous owner had been an elderly gentleman who'd lived there for 40 years, and he'd taken good care of the place. The lake itself was crystal clear, fed by mountain springs, and completely private. David had checked and double-checked with 3 different lawyers to make sure. The entire lake from shore to shore was his. He'd paid cash for it too. After selling his tech startup last year, David had enough money to buy the property outright and still have plenty left over for renovations. No mortgage, no monthly payments hanging over his head. Just pure ownership. It felt incredible. The moving truck had arrived the day before, and now his living room was filled with boxes stacked to the ceiling. David had spent the morning trying to figure out where everything should go. The cottage wasn't huge, but it had good bones. Hardwood floors, exposed beams, a stone fireplace that looked like it had been there since the 1920s. He was unpacking his 3rd box of kitchen supplies when he heard cars pulling up outside. Not just one car. Multiple cars. David walked to the window and counted 3 vehicles parking in his driveway. 7 people got out, and they didn't look like they were there to welcome him to the neighborhood with cookies. They looked like they meant business. The woman leading the group was probably in her mid-60s, wearing a navy blazer with some kind of official badge pinned to it. She had short gray hair and the kind of expression that said she was used to getting her way. Behind her were 6 other people, a mix of men and women, all looking equally serious. David opened the door before they could knock. "Can I help you?" The woman didn't smile. "I'm Patricia Holloway, president of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your property." "Okay," David said slowly. "What about it?" "May we come in?" Patricia asked, but she was already moving forward. The whole group pushed past him into his living room like they owned the place. David stood there for a moment, stunned by the sheer boldness of it. These people had just walked into his house uninvited. Patricia pulled out a rolled-up map from her bag and spread it across his coffee table, pushing aside his unpacked books without asking. "This," she said, pointing at the lake on the map, "has been enjoyed by our community for over 30 years. There seems to be some confusion about access rights." David felt his stomach tighten. "There's no confusion. I own the lake. It's private property. It's in my deed," a heavy-set man with a red face spoke up. "I'm Gerald, vice president of the HOA. Look, kid, I've been living in Lakeside Meadows since before you were probably born. That lake has always been open to the community. Every owner before you understood that." "Well, I'm sorry, but that's not how property ownership works," David said, trying to keep his voice calm. "The lake is clearly marked as part of my property in all the legal documents. I had multiple lawyers review everything before I bought this place." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Legal documents can be challenged. What matters here is precedent and community tradition. 47 families have been using this lake for swimming, boating, and fishing for decades. You can't just buy a piece of property and cut off an entire community from their recreational space." "It's not their recreational space," David said, his voice getting firmer. "It's my property. I paid for it fair and square." Another woman, younger than Patricia but just as stern-looking, chimed in. "Do you have any idea how much property values in our neighborhood depend on lake access?" "You're going to destroy our home values." David shook his head. "That's not my problem. I'm sorry if previous owners let people use the lake, but that doesn't create any legal rights. I looked into this extensively. There's no easement, no public access agreement, nothing. The lake is private." "Then we'll create one," Patricia said flatly. She pulled out a document from her bag. "This is a proposed easement agreement. It grants the Lakeside Meadows HOA permanent access rights to the lake for all current and future residents. You'll sign this and we'll file it with the county. Problem solved." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You want me to just give away my property rights because you've been trespassing for years? That's not going to happen." Gerald's face got redder. "Trespassing? We're not trespassing. This is a community resource." "A community resource on my private land," David shot back. "Look, I understand you're used to using the lake, But that doesn't mean you have the right to keep doing it. The previous owner might have let it slide, but I bought this property specifically for the privacy. I'm not running a public park here. Patricia stood up straighter and her voice took on a threatening tone. Let me be very clear about something. The Lakeside Meadows HOA has significant resources and excellent legal representation. We also have connections in this county that go back generations. If you refuse to cooperate, we will make your life here extremely difficult. We can tie you up in court for years. We can make sure every permit you need for your little renovation projects gets delayed indefinitely. We can make you wish you'd never bought this property. David felt his blood pressure rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. Are you seriously threatening me right now? In my own home? I'm telling you reality, Patricia said coldly. You have 48 hours to agree to the easement. If you don't, our attorney will file a lawsuit on Monday morning. And trust me, you don't want to go down that road. I think you all need to leave, David said, his voice steady despite his anger. Right now. Patricia rolled up her map slowly, deliberately, like she had all the time in the world. You're making a mistake. This community takes care of its own and you're not one of us. Not yet. Maybe not ever if you keep acting like this. Gerald pointed a finger at David as he walked toward the door. That lake has belonged to this community since the neighborhood was built. Some city boy with money isn't going to change 40 years of tradition. You'll see. The group filed out slowly, several of them giving David dirty looks on their way past. Patricia was the last to leave. She paused at the door and turned back to face him. 48 hours, Mr. Chen. Think very carefully about your decision. You have no idea who you're dealing with here. We've run off troublemakers before and we can do it again. This is our community, our lake, and our way of life. You're just a temporary obstacle. She left without waiting for a response, and David watched through the window as all 3 cars backed out of his driveway. His hands were shaking slightly. He'd owned the property for 3 days. 3 days, and he already had an HOA threatening to sue him and destroy his life. David walked back to his coffee table and sat down heavily on the couch. The box of kitchen supplies was still half unpacked beside him. He'd imagined his first week in his new home would be peaceful. Maybe meeting some friendly neighbors, exploring the hiking trails around the property. Instead, he had 7 angry people demanding he give up his legal rights to his own land. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. He needed to call his lawyer. But first he just sat there for a moment, looking out at the lake through his window. It was so beautiful and peaceful out there. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. It was his lake, his property, and he'd paid a lot of money for it. No HOA was going to bully him into giving that up, no matter how many threats they made. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. He just hoped he was ready for what was coming. The certified letter arrived exactly 48 hours later, just like Patricia had promised. David signed for it at his front door, and the mail carrier gave him a sympathetic look before driving away. Everyone in this small county seemed to know everyone else's business. He opened it right there on his porch. The letterhead read, Morrison and Associates, Attorneys at Law, in fancy gold script. The letter was 3 pages long, full of legal language that basically said the HOA was demanding immediate access rights to his lake, or they'd take him to court. They cited something called prescriptive easement and adverse possession, and a bunch of other terms David didn't fully understand. But the threat was crystal clear. David called his attorney, Jennifer, right away. She'd handled the property purchase and came highly recommended. When he read her the letter, she was quiet for a moment. This is the intimidation tactic, she finally said. Their legal argument is weak. You own the lake outright. The deed is clear and there's no recorded easement. Adverse possession requires very specific conditions that I'm confident they can't meet. But I won't lie to you, David, they can drag this out. HOAs with deep pockets can make litigation expensive and time-consuming even when they're wrong. So what do? Document everything. If they trespass, call the police. If they damage your property, photograph it. Keep records of every interaction, and try not to engage with them directly. Let me handle the legal responses. David thanked her and hung up. He looked out at his lake, which suddenly felt less peaceful and more like a target on his back. He'd bought this place to get away from stress, not to dive headfirst into a legal battle. But the HOA wasn't done. Not even close. The next morning, David woke up early and decided to walk the property line. He wanted to make sure he knew exactly where his land ended and where the HOA's community began. The fence along the eastern edge of his property was old but solid, running from the road all the way down to the lakeshore. Except when he got to the section near the water, the fence wasn't there anymore. Someone had cut it. Not accidentally either. Clean cuts through the posts, and the entire section had been removed and tossed into the bushes. There was a well-worn path leading from the HOA's community straight onto his property and down to the lake. David pulled out his phone and took pictures from every angle. Then he called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher said someone would come out within a few hours. While he waited, David walked down to the old dock on his side of the lake. He hadn't paid much attention to it before, figuring he'd rebuild it later. But now he saw fresh footprints in the mud around it. Someone had been here recently. There were also beer cans in the bushes and what looked like the remains of a small campfire. The police officer who showed up was young, maybe late 20s. He introduced himself as Officer Bradley and took a look at the cut fence. He took some notes and pictures, but David could tell his heart wasn't in it. "I'll file a report," Officer Bradley said. "But between you and me, you're probably going to have a tough time with this. A lot of people in the Lakeside Meadows community have been using this lake for years. They see it as theirs, even if legally it's not." "That doesn't give them the right to destroy my fence," David said. "You're right, it doesn't. But I'm just being honest with you about what you're up against." Officer Bradley looked uncomfortable. "My sister lives in Lakeside Meadows. Good people mostly. They're just scared about losing something they've had for a long time." David wanted to argue that being scared didn't justify vandalism, but he could see it wouldn't matter. He thanked the officer and watched him drive away. So much for law enforcement being on his side. That afternoon, David decided to install security cameras around the property. If the HOA was going to keep this up, he needed evidence. He ordered a dozen cameras online with overnight shipping and spent the next day setting them up at all the key points: the driveway, the path to the lake, the dock area, and along the property line where the fence had been cut. The cameras proved their worth almost immediately. 2 days after installation, David got a motion alert on his phone while he was inside working on renovations. He pulled up the camera feed and saw 3 teenage kids walking down to his dock. They had fishing poles and a cooler. David grabbed his keys and walked down to the lake. The kids saw him coming and didn't even look worried. "Hey," David called out. "This is private property. You need to leave." The oldest kid, maybe 16 or 17, just shrugged. "Mrs. Holloway said we could fish here whenever we want. She said you're just being difficult and we should ignore you." "Mrs. Holloway doesn't own this property. I do. And I'm asking you to leave." "Whatever, man," the kid said. They packed up slowly, taking their time, making it clear they weren't afraid of him. As they walked past David, one of them muttered something under his breath that sounded like jerk. David went back inside and reviewed the camera footage. He saved it all to his computer and sent copies to his attorney. This was just getting started, and he knew it. Over the next week, things escalated fast. Someone filed a complaint with the county environmental office claiming David was polluting the lake. An inspector showed up, tested the water, found nothing wrong, and left. But it wasted a whole afternoon of David's time. His mailbox was knocked over one night. The cameras caught a dark car driving by slowly, but the license plate wasn't visible. When David went to set the mailbox back up, he found it had been smashed with something heavy. He had to buy a new one. The HOA put out a community newsletter. David found a copy of it stuck under his windshield wiper one morning. The front page had a big article titled "Protecting Our Community Resources" that didn't mention David by name, but made it very clear who they were talking about. It painted him as some wealthy outsider, trying to steal something that belonged to the community. It talked about how families had been making memories at the lake for generations, how children had learned to swim there, how it was the heart of their neighborhood. Reading it made David angry. They were acting like he was the villain here. He'd bought the property legally. He hadn't stolen anything. But according to this newsletter, he was destroying their way of life. The worst part was seeing neighbors from the HOA giving him dirty looks when he drove past. People he'd never even met already hated him. Someone had even started a Facebook group called Save Our Lake that had over 300 members. David found it by accident when he searched for information about the area. The posts were full of people calling him greedy and selfish, suggesting ways to make his life difficult, and sharing conspiracy theories about why he'd really bought the property. One night, David sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, reading through property records and HOA documents. His attorney had sent him copies of everything she could find. He was looking for something, anything that might help him understand how this had gotten so out of control. The HOA had been established in 1983 when the Lakeside Meadows development was built. The original developer had owned the land on the western side of the lake and had built the neighborhood there. According to the records, the developer had also built some docks and a boat launch for the community. Those facilities had been deeded to the HOA for their exclusive use, but the eastern side of the lake, where David's property was, had always been separate. Different owner, different deed, completely private. There was no record of any access agreement or easement ever being granted to the HOA. The previous owners had just been nice enough to let people use it, apparently. And now everyone thought that being nice created some kind of legal right. David kept digging through documents. The community docks on the western shore were interesting. According to what he was reading, there had been some complicated property transactions in the 90s. The underwater land rights and the dock structures had been separated from the surface land at some point. It looked like the docks were actually owned by some company, not the HOA directly. The HOA just had a contract with them. He clicked on another link. The company was called Cascade Marine Management. They handled waterfront properties and dock facilities across several counties. David had heard of them. They had a decent reputation for marina management. He was about to close his laptop when something caught his eye. There was a recent news article about Cascade Marine Management being acquired by a larger company. David clicked on it and started reading. The acquisition had happened 3 months ago, right before he'd bought his lake property. The acquiring company was M.W. Chen Holdings. David stared at the screen. M.W. Chen Holdings was his own investment company. He'd bought Cascade Marine Management as part of a bigger portfolio deal and had barely looked at the smaller properties in the acquisition. He'd been focused on the major marina facilities, not the little community contracts. David started laughing. He couldn't help it. The HOA that was threatening to destroy him, that was vandalizing his property and turning the whole community against him, was paying rent to a company he owned for their precious docks. They had no idea. He spent the next 2 hours going through every file he had on Cascade Marine Management. The contract with Lakeside Meadows HOA was small, just a few $1,000s a year for dock maintenance and facility management. But it was their only legal lake access. Without those docks, they had nothing, and the contract was up for renewal in 4 months. David sat back in his chair and smiled for the first time in weeks. Patricia Holloway had said he had no idea who he was dealing with. She was right. But it turned out she had no idea who she was dealing with either. David barely slept that night. His mind was racing with possibilities. He kept getting up to look at the documents on his laptop, making sure he hadn't misread anything. But no, it was all there in black and white. Cascade Marine Management owned and operated the dock facilities on the western shore of the lake. The Lakeside Meadows HOA paid them for access and maintenance, and David owned Cascade Marine Management. The next morning, he called the operations manager for Cascade Marine, a guy named Robert who'd been with the company for 15 years. David had spoken to him maybe twice since the acquisition, both times very briefly about the larger marina properties. Robert, hi. It's David Chen. I need to talk to you about one of our contracts, Lakeside Meadows HOA. Oh, sure, Robert said. He sounded a little surprised to be getting a call about such a small account. What do you need to know? Everything. Tell me about that contract. Robert pulled up the file and started explaining. The contract had been in place since 1989, originally negotiated by the company's founder. The HOA paid $8,500 annually for dock maintenance, permit management, and facility access. It was a sweetheart deal that had been locked in decades ago and just kept renewing automatically. What's the market rate for a contract like that these days? David asked. Robert was quiet for a moment, probably pulling up comparisons. For the services we provide, similar communities are paying anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000 annually. The Lakeside Meadows rate is seriously outdated. And the contract renewal date? February 15th. About 4 months from now. David smiled. I want you to prepare a standard renewal offer at current market rates. Also, I need a full inspection of those dock facilities. Safety codes, structural integrity, everything. When's the last time we did that? Probably 5 or 6 years ago, Robert admitted. It's a small account, so it doesn't get a lot of attention. Well, it's getting attention now. Send a team out there this week. I want a complete report on my desk by Friday. Robert agreed, though David could hear the confusion in his voice. After they hung up, David made himself coffee and sat on his porch looking out at the lake. The HOA thought they could threaten him, vandalize his property, and turn the whole community against him. They thought he was just some outsider they could push around. They had no idea what was coming. The harassment from the HOA continued all week. Someone let the air out of his tires one night. The cameras caught a figure in dark clothes, but the face wasn't clear enough to identify anyone. David had to call a tow truck to get his car to a shop. Another afternoon of his time wasted, another expense, all because grown adults were acting like children. The Facebook group, Save Our Lake, was getting more active too. Someone had posted David's address, which he was pretty sure violated some kind of privacy rule. People were commenting about driving by his house to check on the situation. One person suggested they should all show up at his property for a peaceful protest. To make their point, David's attorney sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA and their lawyer, but it didn't seem to slow anything down. If anything, it made them more determined. Patricia sent back a response through her attorney saying the HOA had every right to protect community interests, and they weren't backing down. On Thursday, David got the call he'd been waiting for. Robert had completed the dock inspection at Lakeside Meadows. "So what's the verdict?" David asked. "Not great," Robert said. "The docks are showing their age. We've got some serious rot in the main support pilings. The decking needs to be replaced in several sections, and the boat launch ramp doesn't meet current safety codes. Nothing immediately dangerous, but it all needs work within the next year or we're going to have liability issues." "How much are we talking?" "I got quotes from 3 contractors. The lowest bid is $87,000. The highest is just over $100,000. David let out a low whistle. "And according to the contract, who's responsible for major repairs?" "The HOA is. We handle routine maintenance, but capital improvements and major repairs are their responsibility. It's all spelled out in Section 7 of the agreement." "Perfect. Send them the inspection report and the repair quotes. Let them know they need to address this before renewal." "Will do," Robert said. "Should I go ahead and draft the renewal offer while I'm at it?" "Yes, current market rates as we discussed." "And Robert, I want everything by the book. Professional, courteous, completely standard. This is just business." After he hung up, David felt a twinge of something he couldn't quite name. Maybe guilt? These were people's homes, their community. Kids learned to swim at those docks. Families gathered there on summer evenings. Was he really going to pull the rug out from under them? But then he remembered Patricia pushing into his house uninvited. Gerald's red face and threatening tone. The cut fence, the vandalism, the teenagers who'd been told to ignore him, the newsletter that painted him as a villain. The Facebook post suggesting ways to make his life miserable. They'd started this fight. He was just finishing it. The HOA received the inspection report on Friday afternoon. David knew because his cameras caught Patricia's car pulling into his driveway that evening. She was alone this time, and she looked different. Less confident, more uncertain. She knocked on his door instead of barging in. David answered, but didn't invite her inside. "Can I help you?" "We need to talk," Patricia said. Her voice was quieter than before, without that sharp edge of authority. "May I come in?" "I think the porch is fine." They sat in the 2 rocking chairs David had put out there. Patricia was holding a folder and her hands were shaking slightly. "We received an inspection report today," she said, "from Cascade Marine Management." "Okay," David said, keeping his voice neutral. "The docks need major repairs, almost $90,000 worth." She looked at him directly. "You own Cascade Marine, don't you?" "I do." Patricia closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked tired. "How long have you known?" "About a week." "And the contract renewal?" "Will be at current market rates. $45,000 annually instead of $8,500. That's standard for this industry." Patricia did the math in her head, and David could see the color drain from her face. The repairs plus the new rate would require a special assessment of over $2,000 per household. Many of the residents were retirees on fixed incomes. Some were young families already stretching their budgets. It would be devastating. "You're going to destroy us," she said quietly. "No," David said. "You tried to destroy me. I'm just running a business according to market standards. If the previous owners of Cascade Marine had been doing their job properly, your rates would have increased gradually over the years." Instead, you got away with paying below market rates for decades. That's not my fault, so this is revenge, this is business. And property rights. You know, the same property rights you've been trying to take away from me since the day I moved in. Patricia looked out at the lake. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of orange and pink. Most of these people have lived here for 30 years or more. They're good people. They raised their families here. Yes, we made assumptions about the lake, and yes, we handled this badly. But does that mean they should lose their homes when property values crash because we can't afford lake access anymore? That's not my problem, David said, but even as he said it, he felt that twinge again. Stronger this time. Patricia stood up. I came here to apologize and to beg. So here it is. I'm sorry. We were wrong. We treated you terribly, and we had no legal right to demand anything from you. You bought your property fair and square, and we should have respected that from the beginning. She paused. But I'm also begging you to reconsider. There are 47 families in Lakeside Meadows. Elderly couples, young kids, working people just trying to get by. They weren't all part of the harassment. Most of them just got caught up in the group mentality. Please don't punish all of them for the mistakes a few of us made. David didn't say anything. He watched the sunset and thought about what he'd been through these past few weeks. The threats, the vandalism, the constant stress. But he also thought about what Robert had told him about the contract. The HOA had been paying below market rates for 30 years. They'd saved hundreds of thousands of dollars over the decades. Was it really fair to hit them with a huge increase all at once? And there were kids involved. Families. People who probably had nothing to do with cutting his fence or knocking over his mailbox. I need to think about this, David finally said. Patricia nodded. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. She walked to her car, then turned back. For what it's worth, you have every right to be angry. And you have every right to run your business however you see fit. I just hope you'll consider that not everyone in Lakeside Meadows is your enemy. Some of us are just scared people who made bad choices. After she left, David sat on his porch for a long time. He had all the power now. He could make them pay, literally and figuratively. He could charge them full market rates, make them scramble to cover the repairs, watch them struggle. Part of him wanted to. They'd earned it. But another part of him, the part that had bought this property because he was tired of the cutthroat business world and wanted some peace, was wondering if revenge was really the answer. He'd won. They knew it, he knew it, and soon everyone would know it. The question was what he did with that victory. He pulled out his phone and called his attorney. Jennifer, I need your advice on something. Not legal advice, just your opinion as someone who knows the situation. Go ahead, she said. David explained everything. The Cascade Marine connection, the contract renewal, the inspection report, Patricia's visit. When he was done, Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Legally, you're completely in the clear to charge market rates and require the repairs, she said. But you're asking me something else. You're asking if you should? Yeah, I guess I am. Then my answer is this. You moved here for peace and privacy, right? To get away from stress and fighting? Even if you win this battle completely, even if you bankrupt the HOA and make them all suffer, you'll still be living next to a community that hates you. Is that the life you want? Or is there a way to win that also lets you have the peace you were looking for? David thanked her and hung up. He knew she was right. He could crush the HOA, but then what? Live in his beautiful lakefront property surrounded by hostile neighbors for the rest of his life? That wasn't peace. That was just a different kind of war. David spent the weekend thinking. He took long walks around his property, sat by the lake watching the water, and tried to figure out what kind of person he wanted to be. The easy answer was to make the HOA pay for what they'd done to him. The harder answer was to find a way forward that didn't leave everyone miserable. By Monday morning, he'd made his decision. He called Robert at Cascade Marine first. I want to offer the HOA a deal, David said. We'll honor the existing contract rate for the next 3 years. That gives them time to budget for the eventual increase, and we'll finance the dock repairs over 5 years at a reasonable interest rate instead of demanding payment up front. Robert was clearly surprised. That's very generous, especially given how they've been treating you. Maybe, but I'm not doing it for free. I want documentation of everything in the settlement. Every instance of harassment, every act of vandalism, all of it. And there are going to be conditions. What kind of conditions? I'm still working those out. Can you draft a proposal based on what I've told you so far? I'll send you the additional terms by end of day. After that call, David spent 2 hours writing out exactly what he wanted. It had to be fair, but also protect him from future problems. When he was satisfied, he sent it to both Robert and his attorney Jennifer for review. Then he called Patricia. "I have a proposal. Can you gather the HOA board for a meeting tomorrow evening? I'll come to you this time. You're serious?" Patricia sounded shocked, dead serious. "But Patricia, this is a one-time offer. If the board rejects it or tries to negotiate, I walk away and we do this the hard way. Market rates, immediate repairs, the whole thing. Understood?" "Understood. I'll set it up." The next evening, David drove to the Lakeside Meadows Community Center. It was a nice building, well-maintained, with a big meeting room that had windows overlooking the western shore of the lake. The entire HOA board was there, 7 people sitting around a conference table. Patricia sat at the head. Gerald was there too, looking uncomfortable. The others David recognized from that first day they'd stormed into his house. David brought a folder with printed copies of his proposal. He handed them out and then sat down. "Before I explain what's in front of you, I want to say something," David started. "What you all did to me was wrong. You trespassed, you vandalized my property, you threatened me, and you tried to bully me into giving up my legal rights. You turned an entire community against me before you even knew me. That's not okay, and I'm not going to pretend it is." Several board members looked down at the table. Gerald's face was red, but this time it seemed like embarrassment rather than anger. "That said," David continued, "I didn't buy my property to spend the rest of my life fighting with my neighbors. I came here for peace. So here's what I'm offering, and this is not negotiable. You either accept all of it or we're done talking." He walked them through the proposal point by point. First, the HOA would immediately drop their lawsuit and any legal claims to his property. They would issue a formal written apology in their community newsletter, stating clearly that David's property was private and that their previous actions were wrong. Second, the HOA would pay him $15,000, $5,000 for his legal fees, $5,000 for the property damage, and $5,000 for what he called emotional distress and lost time. Some of the board members flinched at that number, but David kept going. Third, there would be a public acknowledgement in the newsletter about who owned Cascade Marine Management and how the HOA's dock access worked. No more pretending the lake belonged to the community. Clear facts about property rights and legal access. "Now here's the other side," David said. "Cascade Marine will honor your current contract rate for 3 more years. That's a savings of over $100,000 compared to market rates. The dock repairs will be financed over 5 years at 5% interest. That comes out to about $1,800 annually per household, instead of a huge upfront assessment." He could see the relief on their faces. Patricia's eyes were actually getting watery. "But there's more," David said. "I'm willing to grant a limited lake access program for HOA residents. You can apply for seasonal passes, $100 per household per year. The passes allow kayaking and canoeing on my lake during specific hours. I'll provide the schedule. No swimming, no motorboats, no fishing, and no alcohol. Activities will be supervised, meaning someone from the HOA will be responsible for each session to ensure rules are followed." "That's more than fair," Patricia said quietly. "I'm not done. Any violation of the rules results in an immediate ban, not just for that person, but for their entire household permanently. I'm not going to police this constantly. I'm trusting you all to police yourselves. Break that trust once and it's over." David looked around the table. "Let me be clear about why I'm doing this. Not because I have to. I could charge you full rates, make you scramble for the repairs, and keep my lake completely private. Legally, I'd be in the right, but I don't want to live in a war zone. I'd rather have neighbors I can coexist with peacefully. This offer is about building something better than what we've had so far. But," he continued, his voice getting harder, "if anyone vandalizes my property again, if anyone trespasses, if I get one more threatening message or dirty look, this deal is void. I will pull the dock contract, charge full market rates, and you'll get nothing from me ever again. This is a one-time chance to fix what you broke. Don't waste it." Gerald cleared his throat. "Can I say something?" David nodded. "I owe you a personal apology," Gerald said. His voice was rough, like the words were hard to get out. "I was one of the worst ones. I said things, made threats, treated you like garbage. I'm a 62-year-old man and I acted like a schoolyard bully. I'm ashamed of myself. My wife told me I was wrong from the start and she was right. I'm sorry." One by one, the other board members apologized too. Some of them seemed genuinely remorseful. Others looked like they were apologizing because they had to. David didn't really care which was which. He just wanted to move forward. "We need to vote on this," Patricia said. "All in favor of accepting David's proposal exactly as written?" 7 hands went up immediately. Unanimous. Patricia looked at David. "We accept. All of it. And thank you. This is more generous than we deserve." "Yes, it is," David agreed. "Don't make me regret it." They spent the next hour working through the details. David's attorney would draft the formal settlement agreement. The HOA would have it reviewed by their lawyer and signed within a week. The newsletter apology would run in the next issue, which came out monthly. The lake access program would start in the spring, giving everyone time to adjust to the new reality. As the meeting wrapped up, Gerald approached David. He was carrying a paper bag. "My wife made you this," he said, pulling out what looked like a homemade apple pie. She insisted. She said destroying someone's property and then showing up empty-handed to apologize is cowardly. So here. It's not enough, but it's something. David took the pie. It was still warm. "Thank you. Tell your wife I appreciate it." "I've been using this lake since 1987, Gerald said. "I taught my kids to fish off those docks. I've got 38 years of memories tied up in this water. When you bought the property, all I could think about was losing all of that. But you didn't have to give us anything. You could have just told us to pound sand and you'd have been right to do it. Instead, you're letting us keep some of what we had." "That means something. It means a lot, actually." David nodded. He didn't quite know what to say to that. Over the next week, things started to change. The settlement agreement was signed. The newsletter came out with a full-page apology that explained the situation honestly. It included a section titled Understanding Property Rights that made it crystal clear what David owned and what the HOA's actual access rights were. There was also a note from Patricia about how the community had fallen short of our values and how they'd treated their new neighbor. The Facebook group, Save Our Lake, was renamed Lakeside Community, and the moderator posted new rules about respectful discussion. Most of the angry posts were deleted. A few people posted their own apologies directed at David, even though he didn't have a Facebook account and would never see them. The vandalism stopped. The dirty look stopped. When David drove through the neighborhood now, some people actually waved. Not everyone, but some. It was progress. 2 weeks after the settlement, David was working on his dock when he heard someone walking down the path. He tensed up for a moment, old instincts kicking in. But it was just Gerald carrying a toolbox. "Thought you might need a hand," Gerald said. "I'm pretty good with woodwork. Built my whole deck myself." David was suspicious. "Why?" "Because I'm trying to be a better neighbor than I was the first time around. And because my wife will kill me if I don't at least offer to help fix some of what I broke." They worked together for 3 hours, replacing rotten boards on the dock. Gerald was actually pretty good at carpentry. They didn't talk much, just focused on the work. When they finished, Gerald packed up his tools. "Looks good," he said, examining their work. "Should last you another 10 years if you maintain it. Thanks for the help." Gerald nodded and started walking back toward the path. Then he stopped and turned around. "You know, I was so angry when you bought this place. Felt like you were stealing something from me. But it was never yours to steal. I just convinced myself it was because I'd been using it for so long. That's not how property works, though. My grandpa had a saying, being allowed to use something doesn't make it yours. I forgot that. Won't forget it again." After Gerald left, David sat on his newly repaired dock and looked out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the autumn colors of the trees on the far shore. It was beautiful, and for the first time since he'd moved in, it actually felt peaceful. Winter came to the lake, and with it came a quietness that David had been hoping for since the day he bought the property. The water froze over in January, creating a smooth sheet of ice that sparkled in the sunlight. He spent his days working on the cottage, stripping old wallpaper and refinishing the hardwood floors. It was good work, the kind that tired out your body but cleared your mind. The HOA kept their end of the bargain. There were no more incidents, no more threats, no more vandalism. The settlement money had been paid in full. The lawsuit had been formally withdrawn. And perhaps most importantly, the community seemed to be moving on. The anger that had filled those first few weeks had faded into something more like awkward acceptance. In February, Patricia stopped by with paperwork for the lake access program. Spring was coming and she wanted to get everything organized before the season started. We've had 23 families apply for passes so far, she told him, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd made for her. I personally reviewed every application and made sure everyone understands the rules. No exceptions, no second chances. Good, David said. How are people feeling about the whole arrangement? Patricia considered the question carefully. Mixed. Some people are genuinely grateful and see this as a second chance we didn't deserve. Others are still bitter, though they're keeping it to themselves now. And then there are the folks who never participated in any of the harassment and just feel caught in the middle of something they didn't start. That's fair, I guess. There's something else, Patricia said. She looked uncomfortable. The board voted to ask me to step down as president, not because I did anything illegal or broke any rules, but because my leadership led us down a really bad path. I agreed with them. My term ends next month and I'm not running for re-election. David didn't know what to say to that. He'd been angry at Patricia, no question, but watching her lose her position over this seemed harsh. That's your choice, he finally said. It is, and it's the right one. Patricia took a sip of her coffee. I've been thinking a lot about why this all went so wrong. I think it comes down to entitlement. We felt entitled to something that wasn't ours just because we'd been using it for a long time. When that entitlement was challenged, instead of accepting reality, we lashed out. That's on me as much as anyone. She stood up to leave, gathering her papers. The new president is a woman named Helen Rodriguez. She moved to Lakeside Meadows about 5 years ago, so she doesn't have the same emotional baggage about the lake that those of us who've been here longer do. I think she'll do a good job managing the access program. After Patricia left, David thought about what she'd said. Entitlement. That was exactly what it had been. People feeling entitled to something just because it had always been available to them, without thinking about whether they actually had any right to it. The lake access program started in April. Helen, the new HOA president, came by to introduce herself and go over the logistics. She was probably in her mid-40s with an organized manner that David appreciated. She'd created a detailed schedule with specific time slots for different activities, and she'd recruited volunteers to supervise each session. I want this to work, Helen told him, not just because it's a nice thing you're doing for the community, but because I think it's important for people to learn that privileges can be earned back through good behavior. We messed up badly. This is our chance to prove we can do better. The first weekend of the program, David watched from his porch as families arrived with kayaks and canoes. Helen was there, clipboard in hand, checking people in and reminding them of the rules. The kids were excited. The parents were careful to stay within the boundaries, and everyone cleaned up after themselves. It went smoothly. And the next weekend, and the weekend after that. By June, the lake access program had become a normal part of the community's rhythm. David would see families out on the water during designated times, always respectful, always following the rules. A few times people waved to him from their kayaks and he waved back. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it wasn't hostility either. It was coexistence, which was what he'd wanted all along. One Saturday morning, David was sitting on his dock with his fishing rod when he heard someone calling his name. He looked up to see Gerald paddling over in a canoe. David had given him special permission to fish during the kayaking hours, partly because Gerald had genuinely tried to make amends and partly because David had started to actually like the guy. Catching anything? Gerald called out. Not yet. You? Couple of small ones. Threw them back. Gerald paddled closer to the dock. Hey, can I ask you something? Sure. Why'd you really do it? The whole settlement thing, the access program, all of it. You could have crushed us. Why didn't you? David thought about that question. He'd been asking himself the same thing for months, honestly, because being right isn't the same thing as being happy. I was completely in the right. You all were wrong, legally and morally, but if I'd exercised all my rights and made you all pay the maximum price, I'd be sitting here on my beautiful property, surrounded by people who hated me, probably dealing with new problems for years. What's the point of having paradise if you can't enjoy it? Gerald nodded slowly. That's wise. Wish I'd thought that way from the start. They fished together for a while in comfortable silence. Eventually, Gerald caught a decent-sized bass and held it up proudly before releasing it back into the water. You know what the funny thing is? Gerald said. I enjoy the lake more now than I did before. When I thought it was just ours, I took it for granted. Didn't think about it much, didn't appreciate it. Now that I know it's a privilege that can be taken away, I notice things more. The way the light hits the water in the morning. How quiet it is. It means something now. After Gerald left, David sat on his dock and looked out at the water. The cottage renovations were nearly done. The property looked better than it probably had in decades. And the constant stress and conflict that had defined his first few months here had faded into memory. That evening, he got a text from Helen. There was going to be a community barbecue next weekend, and he was invited if he wanted to come. No pressure, she wrote, but people would like to meet you in a normal context instead of as the property owner they wronged. David thought about declining. He'd moved here partly to get away from people, after all, but he'd also learned over the past few months that isolation wasn't the same thing as peace. He texted back that he'd be there. The barbecue was held at the community center, the same place where they'd held the settlement meeting. But the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Kids were running around playing tag. Someone had set up a volleyball net. There were tables full of food and music playing from a speaker. When David arrived, there was a moment of awkward silence. Then Helen walked over with a plate of food and a genuine smile. "Glad you came," she said. "Come on. I'll introduce you to some people." She led him around to different groups, making introductions. Most people were friendly, if a bit cautious. A few were genuinely warm. David met young families with kids, retired couples, working professionals. They were just regular people, not the angry mob that had stormed into his house all those months ago. Gerald was there with his wife, Linda, who insisted on thanking David personally for putting up with my stubborn husband and still finding a way to be decent to all of us. "He told me about helping with your doc," Linda said. That meant a lot to him. He's been feeling guilty about everything for months. "He's been making it right," David said. "That's what matters." As the evening went on, David found himself actually enjoying the barbecue. He talked to a retired teacher who gave him advice on dealing with the ancient plumbing in his cottage. He met a family with 2 young kids who were excited about learning to kayak through the Access program. He even had a long conversation with a guy who worked in IT and was dealing with some of the same software challenges David had encountered in his previous business. Around sunset, Helen called everyone together. "I want to say something," she announced. "This community went through something difficult this year. We made mistakes. We learned some hard lessons about property rights, respect, and how we treat others. But we also learned that mistakes can be forgiven if you're willing to make genuine amends." She looked at David. "We're grateful to have David as our neighbor. He had every right to make our lives difficult, and instead he